Today, visitors to the archaeological site of Sparta are often surprised by what they find, or rather by what they do not find. Unlike many other ancient Greek cities, Sparta appears strangely empty. Although some important monuments do survive, most belong to the Hellenistic and Roman periods rather than to the age when Sparta stood at the height of its power. Among the most impressive remains are the Great Theatre and the Roman Agora. There are also the sanctuaries of Artemis Orthia and Athena Halkioikos, whose origins go back to the Archaic period. Part of this absence is easy to explain. Sparta never possessed the monumental architecture of cities such as Athens, Corinth, or Thebes. For much of its history, it lacked even defensive walls. Later, the city suffered centuries of decline. In 396 AD, it was sacked by the Goths under Alaric. During the Byzantine period, many of its inhabitants moved to the nearby city of Mistras, carrying away countless stones and building materials from the ancient settlement. Yet, there is more to the story. For if Sparta appears poor in ancient remains today, part of the reason can be traced to one man, a priest, scholar and antiquarian named Michel Fourmont. Born in France in 1690, Fourmont was no ordinary clergyman. He was a respected scholar, a specialist in ancient languages, and a member of the prestigious Académie des inscriptions et belles lettres. In 1728, he was chosen by King Louis XV to undertake a scholarly mission to the Ottoman Empire. Accompanied by the scholar Jean-Paul Bignon and assisted by his nephew, Claude-Louis Fourmont, he travelled to Constantinople and eventually to southern Greece. Fourmont had been sent to search monasteries and libraries for manuscripts of ancient Greek authors. Although many Byzantine libraries and collections had been destroyed or plundered during the Latin and Ottoman conquests of Constantinople, European scholars hoped that forgotten copies of works by ancient historians might still survive somewhere in the Greek world. While his colleagues succeeded in finding numerous manuscripts, Fourmont failed to uncover the literary treasures his patrons had hoped for. But during his travels, he developed a growing interest in something else: ancient inscriptions. Unlike manuscripts, inscriptions were carved into stone and could be found throughout the Greek countryside. They preserved laws, decrees, treaties, dedications, and lists of officials. In other words, they offered a direct connection to the ancient world. After visiting Athens, Fourmont arrived in Laconia in early 1730. There, he began copying inscriptions on a massive scale. He employed local laborers, investigated numerous sites, and recorded hundreds of texts. But it was also during this period that his methods became increasingly controversial. Throughout Greece, ancient stones had often been reused in later buildings. Byzantine churches, medieval fortifications, and village houses frequently incorporated blocks taken from ancient ruins. Fourmont realized that many inscriptions were hidden within these structures. In order to reach them, he began dismantling walls and tearing apart buildings. He even destroyed ancient remains themselves, convinced that uncovering inscriptions was more important than preserving the monuments in which they were found. The more inscriptions he discovered, the more ambitious he became. By the spring of 1730, Fourmont had turned his attention to Sparta itself. There, he organized large teams of workers and began extensive excavations among the ruins of the ancient city. His letters from this period reveal a man increasingly consumed by his work. Writing from Sparta, Fourmont boasted, "For more than a month, though ill, I have toiled with 30 workers to completely destroy Sparta. There has not been a single day in which I was unable to find anything. Some have given me up to 20 inscriptions." In another letter, he declared that he had destroyed the remains of this splendid city down to its foundations, and that not one stone remained upon another. Modern archaeologists generally agree that Fourmont exaggerated. Sparta was far too extensive to have been destroyed by a few dozen workers in a matter of weeks. Nevertheless, there is little doubt that he caused extensive damage. Later investigations suggest that he systematically dismantled a great number of structures. According to some critics, after copying certain inscriptions, he smashed them, ensuring that no later scholar could verify his readings. Sparta was not the only site affected. According to Fourmont's claims, Hermione, Troezen, Argos and Philacia had suffered the same fate. A short distance south of Sparta stood the famous sanctuary of Apollo Amyklaios, one of the most important religious centers of ancient Laconia. Fourmont became convinced that he had located the sanctuary and immediately set his laborers to work there as well. In a letter, he announced, "I am currently occupied in destroying down to the foundation stone the temple of Apollo Amyklaios." The irony is that modern archaeology suggests that Fourmont had probably misidentified the site. The sanctuary was eventually located elsewhere, meaning that the remains he demolished did not belong to the monument he believed he had found. Eventually, Fourmont returned to France after the Academy recalled him before he could turn his attention to ancient Olympia. But his return marked the beginning of a new controversy. Despite years of travel, he had failed in the primary objective of his mission. He had not discovered the lost manuscripts that had justified the enormous expense of the expedition. Although he had collected hundreds of inscriptions, he seems to have become increasingly dissatisfied with the results. It was during this period that Fourmont started presenting strange inscriptions that no one else had ever seen. Some appear to contain information about the earliest history of Sparta. Others seem to support extraordinary theories regarding Spartan origins. One inscription supposedly came from a mysterious sanctuary dedicated to a goddess named Onga. Another appeared to preserve lists stretching back into remote antiquity. The problem was that many of these inscriptions were not genuine. Modern scholarship has demonstrated that Fourmont forged a number of texts and falsely attributed others to places where they had never been found. In some cases, he appears to have mixed genuine discoveries with invented material, making it difficult for later researchers to separate fact from fiction. Among his most controversial ideas was the belief that the Spartans were descended from Phoenician settlers. To support this theory, he produced inscriptions written in what he claimed was an ancient Spartan alphabet. For decades, scholars accepted these discoveries as genuine. Eventually, however, people began to question their authenticity. During the 19th century, travelers and archaeologists visited the sites he had explored and discovered that many of his claims could not be verified. Some inscriptions turned out to be obvious fabrications. On top of that, his elaborate depictions of ancient Sparta and Amyklaios increasingly appeared to be works of imagination. As a result, Fourmont's reputation declined even further. Yet his legacy remains complicated. On the one hand, his destructive methods caused irreversible damage. His willingness to demolish structures in pursuit of inscriptions stands in sharp contrast to the principles of modern archaeology. Furthermore, his forged inscriptions misled scholars and distorted the historical record for decades. On the other hand, he copied hundreds of genuine inscriptions, many of which have since disappeared. Without his work, valuable information about ancient Laconia and Athens would have been lost forever. Nearly 3 centuries after his journey to Greece, Fourmont remains one of the most controversial figures in the history of classical scholarship.